Hi, I'm Joe Fetterman with Colliers Life Sciences Advisors. Welcome to LabNotes. We're here today with John Grady from Wexford Science and Technology. John is the Senior Vice President for the Northeast region. And John, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Joe. It's great to be with you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, John, you've recently made a change. It's about a year now, I think we discussed. And your focus has for a long time been very Philadelphia centric, and now it's much more regional. And you've been looking at the life sciences through a very important set of lenses. Tell us a little bit about your transition and kind of how you've gotten to this place and how you chose to come to Wexford.
Sure, Joe. You're right. It's just been a year that I joined Wexford. Spent over 21 years at PIDC, working in Philadelphia around business attraction, real estate development, project finance, community level finance. And I'm a Philadelphia guy through and through. I'm born here, raised here, went to school here, have worked here. I love Philadelphia. I love the region. I think it's a great place to work. And I've been really fortunate to commit my career to learning about how business grows, how regions grow, and trying to build the kinds of partnerships and the kinds of relationships that really can support a growing economy, a growing job base, a growing tax base, and all the benefits in terms of quality of life that are driven by those two things. A few years ago, I started to think about whether it was time to transition from PIDC, and we have a great senior leadership team at PIDC, and it was time for that team to be able to step up and provide their voice into the city's economic development and the future growth for the city. And I knew the Wexford guys from my work. Jim Behrens, our founder based down in Baltimore, has been developing on West Market Street for decades in partnership with the Science Center and institutions here. Joe Regan and Pete Kramer were people that I just had a huge respect for. And we ended up in a conversation about their growth as a company, the continued growth in Philadelphia, continued growth in the Northeast part of the country, and also thinking about how the platform that Wexford has developed over these last 15 years could become more diverse, could become more flexible, and where we could start to see some cross-pollination across the platform with our academic partners and with corporate partners. And Wexford's a unique company, a privately held company, really flexible and really focused on a mission around partnering with universities, with academic medical centers, and with employers to really help build ecosystems. And that sense of partnership as the driver of value in a relationship was really familiar to me from my career at PIDC, from my prior years, the 30 years I've spent in public-private development. And I thought that was a really nice bridge, that's continuing to focus on partnerships and relationships and economic growth, being able to sit in Philadelphia and keep my career in Philadelphia, but also start to do some work in other places. We're active in Pittsburgh and Providence in the Northeast. We have some projects in Chicago. We have some opportunities that we're looking at in new relationships with research partners in this territory. So the stars and the moon all aligned, I think, and I was fortunate, and like I said, probably most importantly, that leadership team at PIDC was ready to step up and take the organization and the partnership with the city and the chamber to its next level.
Well, John, it sounds like a perfect fit, a platform for you to leverage across a broader geography and a skill set for Wexford to leverage that is well honed here in Philadelphia. You mentioned ecosystems, and I think that's a great place to jump in because, as our observation as brokers is that one of the things that Wexford really excels at is creating outstanding ecosystems for the life sciences to grow in.
Mhm.
I'd love to explore with you what you have observed to be the critical ingredients. What do you think makes for the successful ecosystem, and what are you guys looking at as you continue to improve what you're doing?
Well, I think you're right, Joe. I think the notion of creating, curating, and expanding ecosystems is central to any kind of growth discussion. It's a little bit of the next economic development theory, right? For a long time, cluster theory was the real focus. And I think the growth of cluster theory around into a model around ecosystems is a pretty natural one. And we see lots of layers to successful ecosystems. For us, it really does start with a core partnership with university R&D, academic medical centers, research institutions. That's where discovery happens. That's where talent is embedded. And it starts with those universities or institutions having a desire to share and catalyze that research into a greater impact. So if the institution culturally or from a business perspective is not interested in that kind of an engaged relationship, it doesn't really go anywhere. So I really think that's an important foundational element. Once you have those willingness of those partners to engage and to continue to kind of grow their side of the equation, then if they have that willingness to engage, that's where we can step in. We in the second layer of the ecosystem, we need facilities, right? We need purpose-built lab buildings. We need space to convene people. We need to have, we really believe strongly in density and proximity and walkability, right? We want that university researcher or the graduate student to be able to walk across the street to their classroom. Maybe it's down the street to their hospital office or clinical location, and up the block to their commercial office. And we think that density and that proximity is, kind of lights the fire. And when you do those things, then you start to create environments that are mixed use, where there's residential and office and retail, and those environments attract talent, right? And so it's more layers on more layers. I think the other thing that we really think about is creating a platform around engagement. We want to create networks. We want to create places where talent gets together and meets people and engages people. Amicus Therapeutics came here from Central New Jersey because they wanted their researchers to be able to, see, a Jim Wilson after work, or participate in a Thursday afternoon venture cafe session with Carl June's lab team, right? And so the layers start to build, and when it's fully functioning, it's robust, it's diverse, and it propels itself forward. And I think that's exactly where Philadelphia is right now, right? We're starting to feel that propelling forward because the layers and the elements of the ecosystem are starting to interlock.
John, Wexford has been developing buildings on Market Street, West Market Street, for 20 years, and there's there's kind of become generations of buildings with One U City and 3675 before it. What are the things that have changed? The tenant mix, the ratio lab to office. What are the things that you're looking at today? And then third party offerings. It seems like you guys have really learned a lot along the way and are building better and better buildings and filling them in new and different ways.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that have been really significant, Joe, that have changed. And I think if you go back even to some of our predecessor companies, like when we were with Townsend Capital and developed 3701 Market, I think early on we were developing buildings, right? And it was a building and it was a transaction. I think what we're doing now is we're building community. And that community is, like I said, it's dense, it's mixed use, it's walkable, it's connected. I think the second thing is that when we were developing early on, 15 years ago, there was a real need from our perspective, and I think from the market's perspective, for the universities to play a strong role in helping to get projects off the ground. Right? The demand side from the private sector was weaker. It was not as deep as it is. And so we really, started, and we see this in almost every market, right? And particularly the kind of secondary markets that we're in, like a Philadelphia and a Baltimore and a St. Louis and a Pittsburgh, is you need that first kind of shock absorber in terms of risk. And Penn and CHOP and other institutions here have been tremendous partners in that regard, Drexel as well. As we move to 3675 market, no university anchor tenants, and we brought in a new kind of anchor tenant, right? 120,000 square feet of shared offices and labs with Cambridge Innovation Center and Biolabs as our partner and our tenant. That was a real change, right? That was acknowledging that the supply and demand mix in Philadelphia needed more access points for people. People needed to get a bench or two or a small office so that they could get out of the academic environment and get into a commercial environment. And that bridge was, I think, really critical. And over the last 2 years that 3675 has been open, we've seen that just flourish, right? I mean, everything that we see happening up and down Market Street came out of CIC and Biolabs. I think the other thing about 3675 is when you walk in the building, you notice a difference. Right, we put a lot of focus in the lobby and the ground level of these buildings. Like I said, we want these buildings in the heart of our districts. We want people to walk in and out. So when you come in the first floor of 3675, it feels more like a hotel than it does an office building. Right, the security function is not in your face. We've got a great partner with Elixir and their coffee bar. We've got casual seating for people. And the Science Center leases and operates the Quorum facility on the ground floor. Drop-in lounge, you can come in anytime. You don't need an appointment, you don't need a membership. You come in, you can hang out. You're a student, you're a faculty member, you're doing business in University City for the day. And I think that advanced our building. And now with One U City under construction, you see some of the construction behind me now. We're taking that to the next level. Building on it, now we have 400,000 square feet of purpose-built lab space with labs and offices, with all of the infrastructure and all of the technology that's necessary to continue to support growing companies and attract new ones. The secret sauce at One U City, with our financial partner at Ventas and the Science Center as a partner, we started that building with no tenants. That's getting ahead of the supply constraint. I think we've seen in the last few years, demand is being constrained by a lack of supply. And there's that fundamental issue of risk and jumping in, and Wexford and Ventas and the Science Center have jumped in, started that building. We've leased probably a third of it before we can even see steel coming out of the ground. And I think that that's a milestone for this market, right? That's the transition. So we've gone from build to suits for universities and medical centers to mixed buildings with a university anchor, to flexible shared spaces as an anchor, now to more spec-built lab space that's being driven by demand. And the final point I'll make on that transition is rental rates, right? And all of our clients and tenants want to pay as much as they need to pay to get space, but as a developer, we need to know that if we invest in these buildings and we provide the kind of upfront infrastructure in these buildings, we need to see that we can achieve rents to make that investment worthwhile. And we're seeing rents probably, even in the 2 years since we delivered 3675, rents are probably up 25% over those 2 years. And that's great. That means you see more investors coming into the market. There's more capital coming into the market. We're going to be able to continue to deliver more product in the market.
John, we've talked together about Philadelphia's role in gene and cell therapy as a leading cluster And we've talked also about the differing needs of these gene and cell companies. Partly, and the good news is fueling that confidence that you had about beginning One U City Square. How has that changed several things? Their use of the space, and to that point, the infrastructure that you're building in to allow for that use. And also, how are you guys looking at CGMP activity as it relates to these gene and cell development companies?
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I think cell and gene therapy has really been the fuel here, right? And where does it start? It starts with the incredible academic research base that we have at places like Penn, Penn Health System, Children's Hospital, the Wistar Institute, Drexel University. You know, that's that basic research driver. And when you look around and you see, I think 7 of the first FDA approvals are based in science coming out of Philadelphia, right? Anybody that's gotten that Moderna shot in their arm, you know, that mRNA research started across the street at Penn, right? And that you can't replace that. That's just an incredible opportunity. And the focus that our institutions and our pharmaceutical industries have had in this market around viruses and around immune health is really paying big dividends in cell and gene therapy. So I think we have to acknowledge that piece. As these companies grow, it's great that what you're seeing is a healthy both ecosystem, but also a healthy supply and demand system, right? These companies are attracting talent here. They're growing their clinical trial base. They're attracting capital. And we're now being able to put them into the spaces they need to facilitate that growth. And one of the things we've seen is, you know, a typical Wexford lab office building would typically be 50% lab, 50% office. That kind of becomes your basis of design, and you build your infrastructure around that. 3675 here is a great example of that standard. I think with One U City, we started to see interest with a higher percentage of lab space, right? So it started to grow to 60%. In some cases, we're seeing it grow to 70%. And that's because of the intensity and the value that the lab operation drives for the company, right? These companies are not large organizations with huge office supports. The lab and the R&D and the science is very much core to their creation of value. And so I think that's why we're seeing more lab space in these buildings. Our One U City building, because we started that on spec, and as we were going through the initial stages of the pandemic, we took a step back and thought about how do we make sure we deliver this building in the market in a really first-class, best-in-class kind of way. And so we pivoted a little bit, went to 100% outside air system for the building, wanted people to feel confident that this was the healthiest building in the market, but also wanted to have that extra flexibility about lab space and the intensity of lab space. So that was a real opportunity. I think it'll be interesting to see as we go forward, you know, does that become a new standard in this market? Or do we continue to evolve the type of infrastructure that the companies are requiring and that we're able to provide? And you asked about CGMP, and I don't want to leave that. CGMP, I think, is one of these things that I started learning about when I was at PIDC and worked with you and your team a bunch on this. And I think there's broad recognition now that, number one, we need more manufacturing facilities and capacity in the market to support these, not only the academic institutions, but the growing companies. We are seeing users in One U City laying out floors for CGMP process. A lot of it is early stage process engineering, some phase 1, and that's a good sign. We have some concepts that we've been working with CDMOs on around how do we bring denser CGMP space into this market. So, you know, maybe it's a multi-story building. It's not going to be a 20-story building, but do we have a mid-rise building that can become a piece of infrastructure with those CDMO facilities and services as a core piece that people can plug into in this environment? And I think that's going to continue to grow. I think you're going to hear more and more about demand for these services. And I think it's one of the great ways to kind of connect this dense environment in University City and a U City Square, kind of in the heart of University City, with some of the larger format opportunities in the market. So we talk a lot with, look at the Pennovation site and the Lower Schuylkill River and the great work that PIDC and Ensemble are continuing to do at the Navy Yard. You can imagine almost an ecosystem around manufacturing here, right? Where that really early stage stuff is happening in the core here. But as the need and the facility requirements grow, you don't have to go to Texas or to Maryland. You can go 5 miles to the Navy Yard, right? And you can have your phase 2 and your larger scale production start here. So I think there's a great opportunity for the region to build more infrastructure around manufacturing and to have it really connect into the core of academic research and early stage entrepreneurship.
John, we'll play this back in 2 years and look at where the Philadelphia cluster is on CGMP and manufacturing. It's going to be really, I think the next 2 years are going to be very interesting in terms of how that all plays out. And
I think we should do that, Joe. I think we should put a marker out there and say, have we advanced the ball on something like manufacturing in the life sciences as a way to grow the ecosystem, right? That's a great shared opportunity and a shared goal that we should hold ourselves accountable to.
I completely agree. We could be talking all day. I'm convinced of it, but I would be remiss. I would absolutely be remiss if we didn't spend a minute to just talk with you about your perspective on other markets.
Sure.
At PIDC, I think you had a good look at what was happening in Boston and how Philadelphia was competitive. And in your role now, you're looking at other cities that are perhaps wannabes to Philadelphia. So let's talk a little bit in that scene. What are we doing really well here? What are the things that are causing other clusters to aspire to be Philadelphia? And how are we similar to, perhaps behind a little bit, a geography like Boston? Let's dive into that.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, and I agree with you. Like we talked about, my engagement in life sciences started in my PIDC days and working with partners at the city and the Chamber of Commerce to think about, as a city and a region, how can we position ourselves, right? And so we looked a lot at Boston and San Francisco, San Diego, that top tier, right? And I think everybody would agree those are 3 places that are probably on a level of their own. When I come over to Wexford now, one of the interesting things about our platform is we're not in those markets, right? We're not in Boston or San Francisco or San Diego, and we're very intentionally in what you might think of as second-tier cities, but second-tier cities that have first-tier research infrastructure, and cities where the life sciences and more broadly innovation are important economic development drivers to the cities and the regions. So I mentioned, in my portfolio in the Northeast here, 2 cities that I've been spending a lot of time in are Providence and Pittsburgh. Very similar to Philadelphia in terms of economic trajectory, transition from manufacturing. The scale across the 3 cities is very different, but the fundamental strategies are the same. And you're right, if I'm in Pittsburgh or Providence, folks want to know what's happening in Philadelphia. Philadelphia's reputation and the messaging that's out there about Philadelphia is really positive right now. People see capital flowing here, right? And when you think about what's Philadelphia done well, I think we really are, number one, we've supported our research institutions. And again, I can't stress enough how much that's the pipeline that drives everything. I think the other things, I think our talent base is really unique here at Philadelphia. And it's not something you see in certainly the second tier markets. You see some of it in a Boston, but places like Boston and San Francisco have kind of turned the corner on talent. Right now, talent is scarce and really expensive. I had a great pleasure when I was at PIDC to work with a lot of folks to help Iovance Therapeutics come here. Right, Iovance was coming out of the Bay Area, and they wanted to bring talent base. Not just that there was a lot of early startup talent coming out of universities, young people ready to fill positions in labs and offices, but there was a more mature talent base, right? There were people coming out of that big pharma talent pool that's throughout this region that's decades old. People who are really experienced in starting companies, right? So when you look around the landscape and you see a Steve Nickberger and you see a Joan Lau and you see people who have done this through their careers, right? I think that's special. And I think that's something that Philadelphia's done a good job of retaining that talent base, supplementing it with people coming out of colleges and universities at the undergraduate, postgraduate, PhD level. And being able for a company like an Iovance to come into Philadelphia and know that they can plug into that is a huge advantage. The other things I'd say that we're doing well, and one is I think we're attracting capital, right? Our star researchers and our growing companies, we're always worried about capital. I look at the data that Colliers puts out every quarter, and we're continuing to see big numbers, whether it's venture, whether it's Series A or B, whether it's a corporate investment, whether it's an acquisition. We're starting to have a healthy supply and demand of capital in companies, and that's I think continuing to support that. And the last thing I think we're doing well, and this will come as a surprise to most Philadelphians, I think we're getting a good message out there. We've beaten ourselves up for decades about how we don't promote ourselves, or we're too Quaker, and we're not proud enough of what we're doing. I think the work that's been going on in a lot of places around a consolidated message about cell and gene therapy, especially, and cell and gene therapy has really brought focus to our message. And people all around the country, wherever I go with our Wexford platform, people know about what's happening in Philadelphia. And I don't think that was always the case. I think, we were always the best kept secret, right? You never want to be a best kept secret. That's not good for anybody. And I really think that whether it's the chamber, the city, the academic institutions, private industry, I think everybody's pulling in the same direction here. And I think that that's something that other markets are starting to notice.
John, that's a great note to wrap up on. And really appreciate you for being a spokesperson and a voice that really has been a promoter for this cluster for years. As I said, there's so much more to cover. You're going to have to come back. There's no doubt about it. But thanks so much for being with us today.
Yeah, Joe, I really appreciate the invitation. I appreciate the work that you and your team are doing in the city and the region here. And you guys are big advocates and big contributors to this success. And I look forward to, chapter 2, 3, and 4 when we're ready to keep talking.
That's great. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Joe. Take care.